Cold Case Talk. Together we take unsolved homicides and disappearances one step further.
Welcome to Cold Case Talk. I'm Kara Porter, one of the co-founders of the Cold Case Coalition.
And I'm Tom Harvey, another co-founder. This is the last of 3 episodes. Joe Santi was wealthy with businesses and investments in Utah and other Western states, but he sometimes also dealt in stolen goods. Then in January of 1977, he disappeared without a trace. We previously debunked claims he fled to avoid financial or family troubles. Now, after extensive research, we reveal what we believe really happened to Joe Santi.
A small part of Joe's aggressive business tactics did involve, buying things that might or might not be stolen. And his wife said, I don't know if they were hot, but he always had a bill of sale.
Back to his apartment, when he was, after he had disappeared, the police report said that they had found a large amount of stolen jewelry in that apartment. So it appears that one part of his business was, his kind of entrepreneurship was kind of on the shady side.
Yeah, he kept track of things, but he didn't necessarily ask a lot of questions about where things were from. At the time of his death, the police estimated that the goods in his apartment, including the guns and the jewelry, etc., were worth perhaps up to $1 million. But many of them were stolen. Again, though, we do want to emphasize this was kind of I think we would both agree, this was kind of a small part of Joe's life.
Yeah. Yeah, it was almost like a hobby, it seems to me, to him. It's kind of like going down and gambling in Vegas or something like that.
Yeah, I think, I hadn't thought of it that way, but it kind of explains a little bit maybe about the last transaction that he was trying to achieve in his life, why he did it. And we're going to get into that in a minute, but I kind of see what you're saying. I think just enjoyed doing that, and maybe it was lucrative.
There was some thrill to it, perhaps.
Yeah. So Joe had some acquaintances who were maybe risky. Now, Mary believed, there was some testimony in the case that Joe had been at least 3 times. The first time, Mary believed that it was somebody with the Royal Inns. It was 1972, and a friend of theirs from Price told Mary he really needed to get a hold of Joe.
This guy says that there's a threat against Joe's life, and he said it came out of California, and it was to beat Joe unmercifully, but not to kill him.
So after that incident, Mary said that she and Joe basically told the Royal Inns contact, we know that was you, you better stop. But there were 2 more incidents at least where Joe's life was threatened. So we had the incident in 1975 that was very dangerous and very interesting. So, 1975, Mary and Joe are in their fabulous home in Salt Lake City. And Joe has just returned from a hunting trip. He always went hunting with a good friend of his. It was a well-known lawyer in Price named Luke Pappas. And Dominic Oliveto, I believe, was also there, and 1 or 2 others. And every time these guys went on their hunting trips, Joe would eat things that didn't agree with him. So he comes back from his hunting trip. He is sick as a dog. He's in the bathroom. And all of a sudden, the phone rings.
Then Mary answers it because Joe is sick. Here's what Mary told an attorney in an insurance lawsuit, as read from the transcript.
One night, they came out to the house at gunpoint, and that's on police record. Somebody came to the house.
Who is they?
I don't know who is they. All I know, he got home from deer hunting. Then, about 15 to 12, I get a phone call, and it was supposedly long distance. And I listened on the darn phone call because Joe didn't hear it. He was sick in the bathroom. He always ate pepperoni and salami when he went deer hunting, and it didn't agree with him.
Tom, they get a phone call. It's almost midnight. And then after she answers it, somebody shows up at the door. Are you thinking that maybe somebody first called to make sure that Joe was home?
That's what it really sounds like, yes.
Okay, and actually, back in '75, they did have car phones. They didn't have cell phones, but some cars did have the phones that were actually in the car, so you could actually do that. I don't know, but so then,
But in any case, it seemed to be timed, kind of exactly right.
yeah. So then, Mary told the rest of what happened.
In the meantime, somebody rang our doorbell, and he was still really sick. He says, "Answer it." I says, "I'm not crazy. I'm not going to answer the door at midnight." Before I knew it, he answered it. I talked to the fellow from the upstairs bedroom. He couldn't see me. He didn't know where I was talking to him from in front of the house. I says, "What do you want?" He says, "A phone." I says, "Go down a few blocks and get a policeman and get a phone there. I won't open the door to you." In the meantime, Joe come running back in screaming, "Get the police! Get the police! There's a guy with a gun out there." See, Joe surprised him. Joe went out the back door and surprised him, and he pulled a gun on Joe. I held on until the police got there, but he escaped down the ravine. They saw the footprints.
Again, fast forward 1976, there is another incident. One day, a man who works at the hotel gets a call from Joe. This man later becomes Joe's son-in-law, but at the time he was just working there. But he gets a call from Joe Santi who says there's someone after him with a gun. Could you come to the house right away? So this man grabs two workers from the local hotel, and they screech over to Joe and Mary's house. And by the time they get there, I guess the guy is gone or the crisis is over. The young man also said that he noticed a couple of times that Joe had a sawed-off shotgun in the passenger seat of his car around that same time period.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things we can conclude from this is that Joe did play the margins at times, and some of these incidences may have been the result of some of that type of activity.
Well, Joe was certainly concerned. Remember that incident in 1972 that Mary thought had something to do with Royal Inns? Just a few months after that, Joe decides he needs it's not really a safe house. It's a safe tunnel?
He needs an escape route.
He needs a way to get out of the house. And so he actually talked with a contractor, and he originally was telling the contractor, it's just to store things, but the contractor started to figure out it was something a little bit more.
There is a concrete-walled tunnel which connects the main house to an old carriage house. The old carriage house is now used as a garage, which opens directly onto the street. Beginning at the carriage house, the tunnel runs in an easterly direction for about a distance of 100 feet and enters the main house on the southwest corner in the area of the kitchen. Mr. Santi first indicated that he wanted a vault room constructed on the south side of the tunnel midway between the main house and the carriage house. He said that the room was to be used for storage of valuable items. Based upon the design criteria, construction details, and other directions, it soon became apparent that what he really wanted was a place to seek refuge or protection. or a mode of escape in the event someone entered his house. I asked him about this, and he indicated that it was what he wanted. He expressed some thoughts regarding a socio-economic collapse of the government or some other type of lawlessness. Among the items he described and which he wanted incorporated into the construction included A. A double steel entry door system consisting of a first door of plate steel which opened outward and therefore could not be pushed in, and a second door which was to be a solid core fire-rated unit which opened inward. B. A source of air and or a circulation system to secure a supply of fresh air. C. A portable electrical system. And D. An escape tunnel made from 30-inch diameter concrete sewer pipe. The tunnel would exit in the ravine and have a hidden exit.
Joe did have reason to believe that he could be at risk at different times, even to the point of having this elaborate scheme where he would be able to escape into the ravine behind the house. Oh, and I should mention that he had been Joe had been burgled before. You know, in the 60s, his house in Price had been burgled, and thousands of dollars worth of diamond rings and jewelry had been stolen. One of his theaters had been burgled around the same time there in Price. So, you know, he understood and felt a need for safety. You remember the apartment complex that he bought, Tom? They actually advertised their security, and interestingly, they advertised that they were that the rooms were soundproof. I can't help but wonder if that came into play later. But it was a selling point for those particular apartments. So now, if we fast forward, Tom, to a day or two before Joe Santi's disappearance, this is what we believe happened to Joe Santi. Let's go to the last time that Joe Santi is seen alive. And it's a Saturday, and as is typical with Joe, he is on to a potential good deal, probably too good to be true. And a friend of his explained exactly what happened that day.
So Terry owned a jewelry store, and it had been obvious that he and Joe had business dealings prior to this.
I own AAA Jewelers. It's basically a pawn shop and jewelry store. Joe called me and said he had a transaction going on with a fellow that had $100,000 worth of coins that had come up from Las Vegas and that he could buy them for $10,000. The men, he told me, had been up to his apartment once or twice prior to his meeting I had with Joe. The one fellow owned a bar and said he told him this other fellow had been coming in the evenings and paying for drinks with silver dollars. And after talking with the fellow, he had indicated that he had with him all of these coins. Joe never indicated that they may or may not have been stolen, but somebody who was going to sell something worth $100,000 for $10,000, I told Joe it sounded awfully fishy. So Joe, knowing that I dealt for years in coins and various types of things in that area, paper money and so on, he asked me to go with him to appraise the coins, and I told him I would go with him, but I wanted $100. He agreed to that, but at the same time did not have $10,000. So he gave me his diamond ring as collateral for, I don't recall now, either $7,000 or $7,500, somewhere in that area. And I gave it to him on a 30-day basis.
The place that Joe and Terry went to meet these individuals was called Swanee's. It was owned by a guy named Harold Swanson. And for those who might be from the area, it was attached or in the same building as a place called Gino's. And it was basically across the street from a motel called the Lone Pine Motel.
Joe and I went into the back door. There was a card room in the back with a card table. Evidently, he played cards in the back. We walked into the bar. It was early, not real early in the morning. It was like 10 or 11 before the bar opened. There was a woman vacuuming, which I assumed to be his wife when we came in the main part of the bar. This Harold Swanson was behind the bar. Joe went over and threw the $10,000 cash all over the bar and said, "Okay, where are the coins? Get a hold of the guy." I said, "Joe, put that money away. You don't." Well, the man then said he would go to the motel down the street, which didn't have a telephone. It was a low-price motel, and get the guy and have him come up and then have Joe and I go down there. He'd gone a short period of time and came back and said the maid was in the room and the guy couldn't come up right then. So Joe and I proceeded to sit and wait for a period, I would say 2 to 3 hours.
So they're in the bar, and whatever it is, at some point, Terry, Joe's friend, starts to feel nervous about the situation.
This Harold Swanson, we never did see another man, kept going out and making this excuse. We're sitting there waiting for a phone call at a payphone there in Swanee's lounge. Joe finally said to me, "What do you think?" I said, "Joe, I think it's a setup. I think they thought you would come out here with this $10,000 cash and they were going to rob you. But I said they weren't expecting you to bring me, and because of that, they now are all up in the air. I don't think there are any coins. I think they were out just to rob you." So after that, I said to Joe I had to get back to work, and he says he thought he'd hang around there for a few minutes and asked this Swanson if he'd take him back uptown.
Years later, there was an acquaintance of the Santi family who said that he believed he had actually seen Joe in a pickup with two individuals that night. We were not able to track him down. There's no real remainder of what he had to say on that. But it's possible that if he did see Joe with two individuals, that perhaps they were in fact giving him a ride back to his apartment. So by the time that the Santi family was arguing with the life insurance company, they were basically pointing a finger at Harold Swanson. It was a little bit convenient to do that because Swanson had died in 1984. But we did go ahead and do some checking just to even see whether it was a possibility that Swanson could have become involved in something like this. First of all, Swanson was actually from Carbon County, which is where Price is. And we know that Joe tended to like people from Carbon County. So it's entirely possible that Joe knew him. In fact, I think it's possible that he was one of the students that Joe would give those free tickets to the theater. Swanson did have a prison record. For example, in 1967, he was charged with theft, and there was a very dangerous high-speed chase that year. They were going like 100 miles an hour to avoid police in basically residential Salt Lake City. And then he finally pulled over when the cop came up next to him and aimed his gun at him. Swanson was reputed to be a fence. Well, of course, so was Joe, right? And 2 years before Joe's disappearance, Swanson had been shot in kind of a weird incident. The story seems to have changed as to what happened, but because at first it was another one of those local small motels.
That's right. At first, Swanson said he had been shot while in the motel parking lot, but then he claimed a gunman forced him into a room where he was shot while trying to escape.
But it kind of sounded a little bit to me kind of similar to what they were trying to arrange with Joe, right, Tom?
Yeah. Right.
Joe, yeah.
Yeah, it sounded very similar to it. It's like it had been done before.
I kind of thought so too. And frankly, you and I talked about this. Swanson had somebody basically after him, right? Okay, Swanson's home had been broken into in 75, and they had stolen, let's see, $6,300 worth of jewelry, coins, and cash from Swanson's home. Remember, this is in 75. And a couple of weird things had happened also. Just 5 months before Joe Santi's disappearance, someone had doused Swanson's bar in gasoline. They had even poured gasoline in the kegs. Remember that?
Very thorough job.
Very thorough, and had left a timer. What do they call it? Ignition device had been left there. That when the neighboring business smelled gasoline, called the fire department, and when the fire department got there, there was 30 minutes left on the ignition device. That was weird.
Somebody was after Swanee or Swanson.
I think so. I mean, is it possible that he was rigging it up himself? We didn't. That didn't seem to be his style, but we think somebody was out to get him. I mean, if you're going to try to fake something like burn down your own place, I don't think you're going to put beer. I don't think you're going to put gasoline in the beer kegs, because that's pretty suspicious anyway.
And again, another indication that Harold Swanson himself was involved in some shady activities.
Yeah, I think so. So Swanson, I mentioned earlier that Swanson had died in 1984. And I think I also mentioned that a friend of the family said that he had seen Joseph Santi with two men. It's kind of convenient, but this friend said that one of the men was Harold Swanson. Again, like I said, Swanson wasn't around to defend himself. But even that's weird as to why Harold Swanson was not around to defend himself. 1984, Harold Swanson is pulled over in a routine traffic stop. It's just a traffic violation. And suddenly he floors it. He takes off. He is going 90 miles an hour, not just in the residential area, but the residential areas near his own home. And unfortunately, he gets on 9th South and does not realize that 9th South ends. There's a big body of water on the west side of 9th South. And to keep people from accidentally driving into the big body of water, there is a huge berm. So he is going 90 miles an hour down this road to get away from the cops. And he plows into the berm, and the car then goes on into the water. But he basically is dead before, he doesn't drown. He was killed from the impact. And so you and I both thought, well, what was in the car, right? What was going on? And you remember? Nothing.
And we wondered, was there a warrant out for his arrest for something?
Right. And the answer to that was no. There was no contraband in the car. The car was not stolen. There was no warrant out for Harold Swanson. They literally, the police could not come up with any reason why Harold Swanson would have taken off like he did. People, you could theorize, I guess.
Yeah, you can speculate,
Right.
But we just don't know.
We don't know. I did sort of a little informal survey and kind of asked people, and some people, they don't have any idea, but some people kind of thought, well, he may have thought he was there to be arrested or something.
Right. Maybe for the disappearance of Joe Santi, but also maybe he had committed a more recent crime and thought maybe he was going to be arrested for that, when in fact there was no warrant out for his arrest for any crime.
I kind of wondered because for a brief period of time in 1983, Salt Lake City PD, and I mean brief, they took another look at the case, or they at least received some information or something. I think it's possible that they went and talked to Swanson again. When they just sort of did a brief follow up in 83, his death's in 84. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So
or at least maybe tried to contact him, and
oh yeah,
which maybe weren't successful, but he might have been paranoid that they were onto him or something.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, it is unfortunate that we're not going to know. So this leaves a lot of questions about what happened in this case, and we actually wrote some of them down, and we've had several debates about them. One question is, what happened inside Joe Santi's apartment in January 1977? And I honestly don't know whether you and I have the same theory or not. So let's find out. Do you have a theory?
Yeah, sure. So I think that what happened is that Joe had invited probably Swanson and somebody else to come over and finish the deal. But that he thought was going to take place, the exchange of $10,000 for $100,000 worth of jewels and coins and stuff. But I don't think there was any intention on the part of the other parties to actually do some type of exchange. I think it was just a way of robbing Santi of $10,000. And so they got in there into his apartment and, either talked him out, but I think more than likely threatened him and maybe smacked him somewhat that's why you might see a few drops of blood around, obviously not very hard. And then they all went outside and Joe Santi was, the money is gone and Joe Santi was never seen again.
I tend to have a similar theory. I tend to agree with Terry that, Terry said that Joe mentioned that these individuals have been in Joe's apartment before. If that's true, then, they've kind of been able to scout it out or something. I'm not sure why they would have been in his apartment before, but I can see why Swanson would have been in his apartment before because they ran in the same circles, both in the area, did engage in the same types of aggressive businesses. I think it's possible that they were there to rob him, maybe didn't think he would report it because he had all of those stolen guns and jewelry, etc. But one thing I feel like we've learned about Joe Santi is that he wasn't the kind of guy that was just going to take guff. And I think he would have resisted rather than, because for one thing, he figured he could work his way out of anything. Mm-hmm. Oh, I have stolen guns. Sorry. Here's my receipts. I had no idea. So I do think that probably something happened. Either he resisted or I don't know. I'm not sure what. You and I have debated about when did this happen. For me, there was a couple of theories. The Tribune had already been delivered on Sunday morning. And I wasn't here in 77, but I was here in the 80s, and the Tribune was usually delivered. It didn't usually get delivered until probably, at least where I lived, 6 or 6:30.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And yet here he is with an open Tribune on the dining room table. that would mean that these guys were still there, or they didn't come until Sunday morning.
Mhm.
You remember we debated whether or not it was a setup, whether maybe they returned because the door was unlocked and
Mhm.
actually laid the paper out. Um, but the problem I have with that is the fact that those little minute drops of blood, part of that was on the Tribune.
Mhm.
So I am not clear. I mean, and it's kind of dangerous. Now, granted, it doesn't get light in January until, after the Tribune would have been delivered. And we also wondered about, why did he have that Tribune? Now, okay, Sunday Tribunes and used to be really cool with all the coupons and stuff. I don't really think that's where he was going with that. Why did he borrow his neighbor's Tribune? Sometimes he was he was kind of a wheeler dealer, right? He might have just thought, I'm going to read the Tribune, put it back on the neighbor's porch, right? Or not porch, it's an apartment complex, but
Which would suggest that he had gotten it early, maybe as soon as it was delivered. And
yeah.
and perhaps had done it before and would read it and put it back before the neighbor went out to get it.
I mean, it strikes me that that's harmless, and that's, I used to deliver newspapers, and people would borrow their neighbors' papers and read them and then give them back, and no harm done. I also had an inkling. I wondered. So I wondered if there was a reason that he had that paper in particular. And I went back and looked in the local newspapers there in Price. Maybe pure coincidence. But that weekend, there had been a massive sweep. I think 15 or more people had been arrested. A lot of it was for narcotics, but a lot of it was for stolen jewelry, jade, which of course was one of Joe's favorites. And I just wondered if he was looking to see if there was anything in the Tribune about these mass arrests that had just happened in his county, just a day or two earlier. But
Yeah.
we don't know. But since there's little bits of blood on the newspaper, we have to assume that whatever caused the bleeding did not happen until Sunday. I mean, I had one person say, well, maybe he cut himself shaving. Possibly, but I don't think if you would then just allow yourself to bleed a little bit over the paper that you just borrowed and are going to return. That one was weird. Let's see. We had also looked. There were no usable fingerprints. Remember that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that would take quite a bit of time to maybe. Well, if you'd been there before, suppose you're a friend and you've been there before, you got to wipe a lot of stuff down. Keep in mind, there was full. Remember the pillowcase?
Mm-hmm.
What they do with gloves? Shovel stuff in there and then leave it on the bed to pretend like it's a burglary?
Right. Or made a decision that they're not going to take it because that kind of stuff could be traced better than just cash.
I think that's true, actually, because he had really interesting and sometimes unique possessions. Even the watch, which was super expensive, you weren't going to find very many of those around. So I think that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been more blood, and it may have taken them a while to wipe everything down.
Mm-hmm.
And they just missed the little tiny micro dots on the Tribune and on the pen there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we had talked, another question that we had, why was there jewelry in the bag? And it could have been staged, could have been actually stuck the stuff in the bag when things went south with Joe. But more specifically, what do we think actually happened to him? In a nutshell, we believe that the evidence strongly supports the conclusion that Joe Santi went down to cut a shady deal for some jewelry with some individuals who had already had violent encounters in similar situations before, and one of whom may have been desperate, may have had ties with out-of-state crime organizations, but Joe could not resist a deal, and so we think we tend to agree with Terry that when Terry said, "I'm not sticking around for this," and Joe said, "I'll get a ride back with these guys." Okay, now they knew where he lived. They may have never left. They may have given him a ride and then never left until the deed was done. And we don't know whether they intended to kill him or not, but we believe that they did. And I believe it was probably to avoid being identified, because one of the two men was very well known to Santi. Now, we don't have any idea where he ended up. There were a lot of rumors. Remember seeing all of those?
Yeah, mine shafts, he's seen in Vegas, that type of thing.
Well, there were rumors the whole time. He's left the country. People kept saying, "Oh, I bet he went to Greece." And his daughter would say his family's not Greek. In an earlier podcast that we did called Bodies in the Desert, we pointed out that you can be well into the desert in less than a 15-minute drive from Salt Lake. Or there are thousands of mine shafts. Or the Great Salt Lake, which at the time, was a very convenient place to dump people. Not so much anymore, sadly. Oh, that's not bad. I did not mean it's not convenient to dump bodies. What a bummer. I just meant the Great Salt Lake is drying up. It's very upsetting to people who live here. To end our podcast, we thought we would give you a sense of who Joe Santi was.
You're going to hear now from Joe and Mary Santi's granddaughter, Joey.
And she saved animals. She loved plants. She was a shopaholic and really enjoyed decorating, and really took good care of me growing up. I remember one Christmas, I got a dollhouse the size of me, and I know it was her behind that because she always went crazy with the decorations, and she would make sure that the tree was up at my mom's house with me because my mom was working full time, and then she'd put it up in her home. And giant Easter time, she had life-size Easter eggs out front. Like, she just always went the extra mile to make it a very fun event, and that was Mary's personality, honestly, with everything she did. But she after my grandpa's disappearance, I was told that she became very dark for a bit. Drank more. There was, she became very angry with all that occurred, and you can't blame her with some of the things that you hear that she had to go through. But when I was born, like, she'd stopped drinking. I think something changed for her, and she had something to kind of happy to live for again. And I'm grateful that her and I had that bonding time before she had passed. I remember going to the grocery store with her, and I would check out the local grandfathers and say, "Look at that guy, Grandma. Could we get him for a grandpa today?" Because I was always trying to set her up with a grandpa, because I knew that mine had, disappeared. And I always knew the story, that nobody knew what happened. I didn't know the details, and some of the things that I've even learned with you all I didn't know. But I always knew that he disappeared, and we'd hope he'd come back one day. And I was shared that, I was named after my grandpa Joe and my dad Paul, so Joey Paula, that's where the name came from. But what an amazing man my grandfather was. Businessman, all of that. Anybody who I was introduced to in Price growing up, well, this is Joe Santi's granddaughter. And it's almost like I was famous because he had made such a name for himself. And even when Mary passed to the same thing. You know, they were both very well known. And I think they, as you shared in your video, they did make an impact, you know, sharing the video or the movies, opening up for the elderly and things like that, like they did. But even more than that, I know that they tried to make a difference in their town.
A postscript. The nation's foremost academic expert on cold case investigations, Dr. Rachel Walton, was a special guest at our showing of the Santi podcast. Afterwards, we had a chance to talk to Dr. Walton.
So you, of course, have written the definitive textbook in the United States on cold case investigations. And you have an acronym called MOM. Explain that to us and how you think that would relate to Joe Santi.
And your presentation was dynamically outstanding. That's really one of the best that I've seen. Basically, MOM stands for who had the motive, who had the opportunity, and who had the means to commit the offense. And your presentation today shows that he lived a very, very high-risk lifestyle. So your victimology, even though you didn't use that word, you really hit the victimology that investigators would look at. You know, the victimology of your deceased. And, you know, obviously I can't imagine that he is not deceased. So that was an excellent presentation, and you really covered those bases. But your presentation also shows how extensive these cases can be when a detective goes to pick them up. Because I really doubt that a lot of what you showed was in the original police files, i.e. the civil. That's one of the things that I like to talk about when I teach this topic is, look, you want to get all your sources of information, and civil files will give you names and further build upon actions of the victim, actions of your other players who are your key people here. And just one or two lines, testimony in a sentence in a deposition, for instance, could blow a case wide open here. But no, you brought in the civil. The interview with the judge was outstanding. I thought that was great. But it's knocking on doors. It's shoe leather. The pictures of the archives brought back so many memories for me, because you're going to be going through papers. You're going to be going through those files. You're going to be looking for that smoking gun or that, you know, that gem, that little golden nugget.
If you have information about this or any other unsolved homicide or missing person case, now is the time to speak up. You can contact us on our website at coldcasetalk.com or call the Cold Case Coalition's confidential tip line at 385-CLUE-313. That's 385-258-3313. Let us know what you think of the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Cold Case Talk. By subscribing, rating, reviewing, and sharing this podcast with others, you help us keep these cases in the light.